He was already bleeding when he reached the sanctum. The Kabanda fight had left him depleted. Sanguinius, the great angel, Primarch of the IXth Legion, who had fought through the 55-day Siege of Terra and held the Eternity Gate against the final Traitor assault, had broken the Bloodthirster of Khorne over his knee in front of both armies, and then held the palace's last threshold until the Eternity Gate sealed behind the final defenders. But on the Vengeful Spirit, separated from his legion in the psychically warped space of Horus's flagship, where the ship and the palace bled into each other, where steel met stone and sky met steel in configurations that ignored the geometry of real space, Sanguinius faced the Warmaster alone, wounded, exhausted, carrying the full weight of a siege that shouldn't have held as long as it did. He knew it was coming. That is in the record.
Across the Horus Heresy series, Sanguinius is described as possessing genuine precognitive vision. He had long foreseen what lay ahead, and he had recognized that his own visions of his inevitable death at the hands of the Warmaster would eventually come to pass. He saw the sanctum. He saw what happened in it. He didn't change course. He went anyway. That choice, boarding a ship knowing it ends in your death, is the foundation of everything Sanguinius means to this setting. The white wings, the artificer armor with its carved rubies at the chest, the central jewel cut in the shape of a heart set on gold flames, the way he soared above the Eternity Gate and threw a greater demon's carcass back into the enemy's ranks. None of it means what it means without the prescience. Sanguinius walked into his own destruction voluntarily, carrying the full weight of what was coming, and the blood angels have called him the Great Angel for 10,000 years because of it.
But his prescience changes the question of how he died. Because if Sanguinius saw his death coming, and he did, then so did the Emperor. And that is where the official story begins to fracture. One honest caveat before continuing. No Black Library novel and no Games Workshop publication explicitly states the Emperor chose to let Sanguinius die. What follows is the strongest read of the canonical evidence, built from confirmed primary texts. Where the evidence is probabilistic, it will be stated as such. The dominant reading of Sanguinius's death treats the Emperor as culpable through failure. He withdrew underground to pursue the Webway project while Horus led the Great Crusade. He didn't tell his sons about chaos. He was emotionally distant, strategically arrogant, unavailable at the moments his sons most needed him. In this framing, Sanguinius died because the Emperor wasn't there. One more casualty in a war that an arrogant father brought on himself through 3 decades of secretive disengagement from the sons he had shaped for conquest. There is canonical weight behind this. The Primarchs genuinely suffered from the Emperor's abandonment. Their hurt feelings over his retreat to a secret project he refused to explain laid the seeds of corruption that eventually blossomed into the heresy. That sequence is documented. The bad dad reading isn't crazy, but it requires the Emperor to be, at his core, a man who miscalculated, who stumbled into the worst civil war in human history through a failure of emotional intelligence and an excess of arrogance, who watched his son die on the Vengeful Spirit because he simply wasn't paying close enough attention. The Webway project makes that reading very difficult to sustain. The Great Work, the Imperial Webway Project's official designation, was a multi-century engineering undertaking, requiring tens of thousands of Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests working continuously. The Golden Throne itself built around a psychic amplification device the Emperor had discovered buried beneath the Terran desert, and a sustained personal investment of focus and power that the Emperor maintained for over 2 standard centuries before the heresy forced him to lock himself to the throne full-time.
The project's purpose was to remove humanity's existential dependence on the warp for interstellar travel, not to solve an existing crisis, but to preempt one the Emperor could see coming. You build a 2-century infrastructure project because you can see where the current arrangement ends. And during the heresy itself, in telepathic communication with the astropath Kai Zulain, the Emperor revealed that he already knew his ultimate fate and had accepted it as the price of a failed attempt to reunite humanity. He said that during a war he was still fighting. He accepted the outcome before it concluded. A man who miscalculates does not accept his miscalculation in advance. He either denies it or fights to prevent it. The Emperor did neither. The argument here isn't that the Emperor was smarter than the bad dad reading allows. The argument is that his foresight, which is canonically confirmed in primary text, points toward a specific civilizational calculation, and that Sanguinius's death is best understood as its cost. Aaron Dembski-Bowden's Master of Mankind, the 41st novel in the Horus Heresy series, is the canonical document of how the Emperor's prescience actually works. The novel follows custodian tribune Ra Endymion through the Emperor's secret war in the Imperial Webway, and the Emperor speaks about foresight in direct exchange with Ra. The passage has been widely reproduced across the fandom because it's one of the few moments in the entire series where the Emperor explains his own nature in plain terms. To know a trillion possible futures, and to be left to guess at the infinite ways of arriving at each one. He sees destinations, civilizational outcomes, the long shapes of where things end up. He can't run a granular simulation of every junction on every road. The variables are too many, the interactions too dense. He can see that one class of outcomes ends in extinction. He can see which outcomes survive. He can't guarantee which path his decisions select, and the same novel introduces the additional complication that in warp-adjacent prescience, the act of glimpsing a future can sometimes alter the very fate you approach. There is an observer effect built into looking. Every act of foresight carries its own distorting cost. What this establishes is a being with a specific, bounded, deeply powerful kind of vision. He sees the destination, but not the full route. He can see that a galaxy where humanity depends on the warp for travel eventually ends in extinction. And so, he builds the Webway project. He can see that the heresy ends with him on the Golden Throne, and says, mid-heresy, that Horus will be defeated, but someone else will take his place. Because he has already read the civilizational long arc beyond the battle he is fighting. He thinks on scales that make tactical decisions look like footnotes. A being who thinks at that scale can see what kind of Imperium survives 10,000 years of unrelenting pressure from chaos, xenos, and internal collapse. He can see what it requires. And when you hold what it requires alongside what Sanguinius was, the structural incompatibility becomes visible. James Swallow's Fear to Tread, the 21st novel in the Horus Heresy series, establishes Sanguinius not as an icon, but as a governing mind under genuine pressure. The novel covers the Blood Angels in the Cygnus cluster, a trap laid by Horus with demonic forces on an industrial scale, that forces Sanguinius to confront the red thirst and the black rage within his own legion before they fully manifest. The flaw is present in some of his sons already. He is aware of it. He makes the decision that defines everything about his leadership. When Brother Alatros succumbs to the thirst on Melchior, Sanguinius executes him personally. His first captain, Ralderon, applies the mourning paint himself. The Legion's master apothecary swears to secrecy. Sanguinius carries that knowledge privately, protecting his legion from the fear of what they might become. He also when his blood is shed and the responsible parties can't be reached, orders the destruction of a world. Our blood won't be shed by those who dare not show themselves. There will be no death without reciprocity here. On my legion, I swear it. He makes ruthless military decisions. He isn't a gentle idealist who flinches at necessary violence. But the governing tension of Sanguinius throughout Fear to Tread is the deliberate holding of justice and mercy, truth and patience, law and compassion in simultaneous balance. He never abandons any of them when it would be institutionally simpler to. He treats the people he leads as ends in themselves, extends grace in situations where punishment was easier and arguably more effective, maintains his principles under conditions specifically designed by Horus to break them. His mercy isn't naivety.
It's a structural feature of his philosophical approach to rule, something he chose and maintained consciously, not a vulnerability he couldn't defend. Within the novel, a glimpsed vision shows Sanguinius crowned, a future in which he leads the Imperium. That timeline existed as a possibility. Something foreclosed it. At the Siege of Terra, Dan Abnett Saturnine places Sanguinius commanding the Gorgon assault axis, one of 3 simultaneous assault vectors against the Eternity Gate, the deepest defensive position of the Imperial Palace. He crested a Warlord-class Titan 40 meters above the ground, dropped onto its shoulders, and destroyed it alone. He held the Eternity Gate through 3 successive Traitor assaults and threw each one back.
When Kabanda, a greater demon of Khorne, came forward before both armies and bellowed a challenge, Sanguinius met it in open air. The two of them trading blows high above the heads of every soldier on the field, was cast down hard enough to pulverize the Ferocrete below, pushed himself back up, seized the Bloodthirster by ankle and arm, broke its spine over his knee, and hurled the carcass back into the enemy's lines. The defenders on the wall had been on the edge of collapse. They held. The Siege of Terra's own account makes the structural role explicit. Many defenders would have surrendered to Angron's forces, given the weight of what they faced, had it not been for Sanguinius. His presence wasn't a morale supplement. He was the load-bearing wall of the entire Imperial defense. A Primarch who functions as a load-bearing wall in a crisis is exactly what the post-heresy institutional order was designed to make permanently impossible.
Rabute Gilliman wrote the Codex Astartes in the immediate aftermath of the heresy, and its primary structural purpose wasn't tactical. It was institutional. Every Space Marine Legion, forces numbering in the tens of thousands, commanded by a single Primarch, was split into chapters of approximately 1,000 warriors. No single commander would ever again field Legion-scale force projection. No single figure could again command the kind of military loyalty that, if turned or corrupted, could threaten the entire Imperium. The Codex was designed to make the conditions that produced the heresy impossible to recreate. It decentralized military power to the point of institutional granularity. A living Sanguinius defeats the purpose of that architecture, not through malice, through existence. The chapter master of the Blood Angels commands 1,000 warriors under the Codex's framework. Sanguinius commands every chapter in the Sanguinary Brotherhood by blood and lineage, and every human soldier who has ever been inspired to hold a wall by the sight of white wings above the ramparts. The Codex fragments military loyalty and distributes it across hundreds of independent chapters. Sanguinius concentrates it in his person at a level no institutional framework can route around. These two realities can't coexist in the same Imperium without one destroying the other's premise. The Ecclesiarchy, formerly the Adeptus Ministorum,
was recognized as the official state religion of the Imperium in the early 32nd millennium, roughly 2,000 years after the heresy. It didn't begin as a designed institution. The Temple of the Savior Emperor grew organically from the emperor cult that formed around the Golden Throne in the years following the siege.
Founded by a veteran of the battle, a man who had renamed himself Fatiticus, the faith spread first through the imperial army and the Armada Imperialis, then through minor adepts and scribes, then outward along the trade routes of the nascent post-heresy Imperium. By the time Fatiticus died at 120 years old, the temple had more than 1 billion followers on Terra alone. Within 2 centuries, the High Lords of Terra recognized what the Emperor's own philosophical legacy could never have admitted. Religion bound the Imperium together more effectively than anything else available. It was incorporated formally into the Adeptus Terra, granted the ecclesiarch a permanent seat on the Senatorum Imperialis, and within 500 years was the dominant organizing principle of 1 million worlds. The ecclesiarchy's power rested on a specific condition. The emperor was inaccessible.
Present as an icon, the incapacitated figure on the Golden Throne, the god whose will required priestly mediation to interpret, but silent as a governor. The gap between the worshipper and the worshipped is where institutional authority lives. Priests speak for a god who can't contradict them. Sanguinius contradicts them every time he walks into a room. The people of Baal Secundus had begun worshipping him as a deity before the Great Crusade had even properly launched, before the emperor arrived to collect him, the instinctive response of people in proximity to what he was. Post-heresy, governing, he would draw spiritual gravity toward himself and away from the incapacitated emperor icon that the ecclesiarchy required as its foundation. Living saints can't be institutionalized. They make institutional mediation unnecessary.
And 2 competing focal points of that magnitude, Sanguinius, present and accessible, and the emperor, divine and silent, couldn't coexist without one eventually collapsing the other's legitimacy. The Inquisition follows a different institutional logic, but reaches the same conclusion. Inquisitors operate outside every hierarchy, bound by no law, empowered to investigate any threat to humanity's future, and to use whatever methods that investigation demands. The implicit license behind that empowerment is unconditional. You can burn a world to root out a single heretic if the calculation requires it. The institutional ruthlessness has to be unconditional to function as a credible deterrent. The moment it becomes contingent on individual mercy, on each inquisitor's willingness to hold justice and compassion in deliberate tension, it becomes negotiable, and chaos does not negotiate. Sanguinius governing wouldn't have formally prohibited that kind of action.
He would have questioned it every single time. He would have extended grace to the accused. He would have searched for the path that preserved the guilty alongside the innocent where any such path existed. He would have done this because it wasn't sentiment for him, it was principle, maintained under conditions specifically designed to break it. The Inquisition can't function through the governing philosophy of a man who spent 3 decades carrying the secret knowledge of his legion's flaw alone, to spare his sons the weight of it. Guilliman returned from his long stasis in the 41st millennium and found the system he built monstrous. In Dark Imperium, Guy Haley records his confrontation with the Golden Throne and his private verdict. The Emperor loves no one man, thought Guilliman. The man who designed the Codex Astartes, who built the institutional framework of post-heresy survival, looked at what his machinery had produced and found it sickening.
The machinery held anyway.
The Imperium he despised was still there 10,000 years after the heresy ended, still fighting, still surviving on the fuel of faith and brutality and the incandescent light of a dead man's psychic presence in the immaterium. That isn't a defense of the system. It's the fact of what the system accomplished. Before Sanguinius boarded the Vengeful Spirit, the Emperor communicated with him directly. In *The Death, Dan Abnett's account of the siege's final stages, the Emperor sends Sanguinius on a vision journey. Not orders, not tactical intelligence, but an attempt to give his son the widest possible comprehension of what the great work meant across its full civilizational scope. Sanguinius comprehends. I am the end product of centuries of a great work. He sees the full shape of what his father built across millennia. He understands the scale. He understands the stakes. Then, Horus drops the shields, and the invitation is issued. Across the siege, the Emperor maintained psychic communication with his servants from the Golden Throne while managing the webway breach that Magnus had caused. He spoke with Kai Zulain. He accepted his own fate. He sent Sanguinius a vision of the great work. A fragment, preserved from the siege novels, captures the register of his communication with Sanguinius during this period. Sanguinius, what transpires on the surface of the throne world, I can't say. What horrors you have endured, I can't imagine. What transpires, not what will transpire. He does not tell Sanguinius what Horus has become in the fullest warp-saturated sense, the confluence of all four Chaos Gods' combined power flowing through the Warmaster, making him, at the moment of the siege, the equal of the Emperor himself in raw capacity. He gives his son the great work vision. He does not give him a path back. Here the strongest canonical counter-argument must be stated, because it's real. Horus controlled the psychic and void shields on the Vengeful Spirit. He lowered them at the moment of his choosing, to invite the Emperor to witness his victory and to force the confrontation on his terms. The boarding sequence from *The Death is confirmed. Horus drops the shields. Multiple parties teleport simultaneously. The flagship becomes a psychically warped space where geometry fails, and ship and palace and sky bleed into each other. Sanguinius's party reaches Horus first. Already depleted from Kabanda, he faces the Warmaster alone. After a fierce struggle, Horus kills him. The Emperor arrives. When the Emperor at last entered Horus's sanctum, he found the rebellious Warmaster standing above Sanguinius's broken, bleeding corpse. That is the canonical line. Horus controlled who could board and when. He may have arranged the sequence deliberately, lowering the shields at the precise moment that Sanguinius was nearest the sanctum and the Emperor furthest from it.
The Emperor's late arrival, relative to Sanguinius's death, may have been a physical impossibility rather than a choice. He may not have had the option. But that question of the final minutes isn't where the argument rests. The argument is older. The Emperor accepted his own fate before the Vengeful Spirit battle even concluded. He possessed civilizational scale foresight, destinations, not paths, and he had already looked at the trillion possible futures and understood which class of outcomes humanity survived. He gave Sanguinius the broadest possible view of what the great work required. He said nothing in that communication that redirected Sanguinius toward survival. He didn't warn him of what the warp had done to Horus in the fullest sense. He didn't attempt to prevent him from boarding. In every communication during the siege, every vision, every telepathic exchange, there is no recorded moment where the Emperor changed the direction Sanguinius was moving.
The bad dad reading says this is failure, negligence. the inability of an arrogant being to perform the simple emotional act of warning the son he loved. The problem with that reading is that negligent beings don't accept their own fates in advance. They don't build two-century infrastructure projects in response to problems that haven't fully materialized yet. They don't look at 1,000,000,000,000 possible futures and understand which destinations humanity reaches in each one. A being with that specific combination of capacities, civilizational foresight, century-scale planning, deliberate acceptance of a known outcome, whose silence changed nothing and whose arrival came after the moment it was no longer possible for anything to be different, isn't a being whose behavior is best explained by carelessness. Horus stood over Sanguinius's body, believing he had won the final argument.
He had given his soul to chaos, bent his will to all 4 chaos gods, corrupted half the legions of humanity, driven his fleet to the heart of the Imperium, and destroyed the most beloved figure in it before his father's eyes. He thought this was proof that defiance of the Emperor could reach anything, that the great angel wasn't protected, that the arch-heretic's power had no ceiling. Everything Horus did on the Vengeful Spirit, he did believing it was the ultimate act of rebellion against a father who had used and discarded him. Horus was the instrument of a choice he never knew had been made. Graham McNeil's The Last Church is set before the Great Crusade, before the Emperor had dispatched a single expedition fleet, before the first Primarch was reunited with his legion.
The Emperor arrives at the last church on Terra disguised as a traveler called Revelation, accompanied by Thunder Warriors, intending to understand why the last priest, Uriah Olifair, maintains his faith in the face of the advancing imperial truth. They debate through the night in Olifair's quarters, sharing wine, moving from argument to counter-argument across every form of religious apology and every form of rationalist refutation. The Emperor isn't performing an argument. He states his position with the conviction of someone who has spent 38,000 years watching what organized faith does to the species he has spent those 38,000 years trying to protect. He declares that civilization will only achieve perfection when the last stone of the last church falls upon the last priest. He argues that religion is used to control populations, that it has driven humanity to its darkest atrocities, that it holds humanity back from what it could become. He destroys Olifair's every defense, not because he is cleverer, but because he has lived through every historical event Olifair is invoking as evidence. In Master of Mankind, he articulates the philosophical foundation of that conviction. For the core of religion is the twinned principle of arrogance and fear. Fear of oblivion, fear of an unfair life and an arbitrary universe. At the end of the night, the Emperor drops his psychic disguise. Olifair recognizes the face he had once seen in a vision. He sees in that final look the dual nature of a being who had both limitless compassion and a ruthless core of violence, a being who truly believed his absolute vision of the future was right, no matter the slaughter or bloodshed its fulfillment might require. Olifair can't follow that. He gives his final verdict. It's a dangerous road you travel. To deny humanity a thing will only make them crave it all the more. And if you succeed in this grand vision of yours, beware that your subjects don't begin to see you as a god. The Emperor nods sadly. He recognizes the choice. He orders his Thunder Warriors not to interfere as the priest walks back into the flames. Olifair was right, and the Emperor knew it before the night was over. The imperial truth lasted less than 300 years into the Great Crusade before the Lectitio Divinitatis began spreading through the expedition fleets. By the early 32nd millennium,
2,000 years after the heresy, the Adeptus Ministorum was the official state religion of the Imperium, its ecclesiarch holding a permanent seat among the High Lords of Terra. Every imperial world had a cathedral. Every crisis was interpreted through the lens of the Emperor's divine will.
The imperial creed had replaced the imperial truth as completely as if it had never existed. And in the 41st millennium, even the imperial truth itself was treated as heresy, punishable by death. The man who destroyed the last church became the god of a billion churches. The man who said religion was fear and arrogance became the object of the most comprehensive act of organized worship in human galactic history. Fabius Bile, for all his crimes, said it plainly to an imperial worshipper he encountered. He never wanted to become what you have made him. He didn't wish to be your God thing. He abhorred such ideals. The slavery of your crippled, blind imperium would sicken him if he had eyes to see it. He sacrificed his philosophy. That happened regardless of any deliberate choice about Sanguinius. The emperor broken on the golden throne couldn't prevent the religious transformation of his legacy. But a living Sanguinius, governing alongside a dying emperor, would have made the consolidation of the emperor cult structurally impossible. Two competing focuses of spiritual devotion, one of them present and accessible and capable of contradicting any priestly interpretation, can't coexist with one unified institutional theology. One absorbs the other, or they collide and both fracture. The emperor as God required the emperor to be unavailable. Sanguinius was constitutionally unavailable to the concept of unavailability. The blood angels proved the alternative. After Sanguinius died, his psychic death echo transmitted through his son's gene seed and bound every subsequent generation of blood angels to the moment of his dying. The black rage, the madness that overtakes blood angels in the deepest moments of battle, makes them relive Sanguinius's death through his own eyes, fighting not the enemy in front of them, but the Warmaster in Horus's sanctum.
The Death Company, armored in black and marked with the blood-red saltire of Sanguinius's wounds, exists because of how he died, and because that death was psychically potent enough to echo through a legion's gene seed for 10 millennia. His death became a sacrament. The devastation of Baal, Guy Haley's account of the Tyrannid assault on Baal and its aftermath, shows how thoroughly that martyrdom is woven into Blood Angel's identity. The Sanguinor appearing in moments of desperate need. The entire chapter's ritual life oriented around a death that happened 10,000 years ago. Sanguinius dead became exactly the martyred saint the Imperium needed. Living Sanguinius could never have been that. A martyr is constitutionally unavailable to the living. Here is what the primary texts confirm and what they leave open. The Emperor's civilizational scale foresight is confirmed in Master of Mankind. A trillion possible futures, destinations visible, paths unknowable, broad, probabilistic,
not deterministic. Sanguinius possessed genuine prescient vision, knew he would die to Horus, and boarded the Vengeful Spirit anyway. Confirmed across multiple Horus heresy novels, the Emperor accepted his own fate before the battle on the Vengeful Spirit concluded. Confirmed via his communication with Kai Zulain, documented through the outcast dead. Horus killed Sanguinius. The Emperor found the body. Confirmed in End and the Death and every summary source. Horus controlled the shields that governed when anyone could board. His lowering of those shields determined the timing of every teleportation. Confirmed canonical.
The emperor opposed religious worship as his deepest philosophical conviction, per the last church and master of mankind. The post-heresy imperium became exactly the theocracy he opposed, confirmed across the imperial truth and imperial cult histories.
The Codex Astartes fragmented military power specifically to prevent any single figure from commanding the kind of loyalty that could threaten the imperium's institutional stability, confirmed in its design history. What isn't in any primary text, a statement that the emperor permitted or arranged Sanguinius's death. That is, reader extrapolated. Black Library's own creative policy maintains that the emperor's ultimate motivations remain deliberately mysterious, because attempting to fully describe the inner state of a being of that nature makes poor reading and produces false certainty where the setting requires genuine ambiguity. The thesis lives in that deliberate gap. The argument does not need a confession. It needs the weight of what was known, what was communicated, and what wasn't changed, measured against the imperium that actually survived.
A being of 38,000 years, who accepted his own fate before it concluded, who built civilizational infrastructure on century scales, who gave his most beloved son a vision of the great work and said nothing in that communication that redirected him toward survival. That being's non-intervention isn't easily explained by negligence. Negligent beings don't run the mathematics of extinction in advance. Negligent beings don't stand outside burning churches and nod sadly at the priest who walks back into the flames. They both made the same sacrifice. Sanguinius died for humanity. He walked into his death knowing what it was, gave everything he had against a Warmaster empowered by all four chaos gods, left his psychic death echo burning in his son's blood for 10,000 years. He didn't want to die. Going was what loyalty required. The emperor's sacrifice was watching. Horus called Sanguinius the one with the emperor's soul in his blood.
If that assessment is accurate, and the characterization across the entire Horus Heresy series suggests it's the most accurate thing Horus ever said, then what the Emperor found in that sanctum wasn't simply a dead son. It was the end of the only thing in the Imperium that was genuinely, constitutionally, what the Emperor himself had been. A being who held justice and mercy in deliberate tension, who treated the people he led as ends in themselves, who fought for the future rather than merely the victory. The depth of that love is the evidence. A being who loved Sanguinius less might have lost him through carelessness. A being who possessed civilizational foresight, who accepted his own fate before the battle concluded, who gave his son the widest possible view of what was required, and who still didn't change the path, isn't a being whose behavior is best explained by failure. Sanguinius gave his life without choosing to die.
The Emperor gave his son, while choosing, across the full scope of what he could see, not to prevent it. Both sacrifices were for humanity. Only one of them was conscious of it. No Games Workshop text confirms that choice was made. The argument is built from the foresight architecture, from the post-heresy institutional requirements, from the Emperor's acceptance of his own fate, from the structure of what he communicated to Sanguinius and what he didn't. It's the strongest available read of the evidence. It isn't settled lore. If you think Sanguinius alive would have found a way, that his mercy and grace and hope would have built something better than Guilliman's bureaucracy and the ecclesiarchy's iron theology, that the post-heresy galaxy would have allowed a different kind of survival, make that case from the texts. The structural argument against it's what this script has laid out.
A counter that can stand against the institutional evidence belongs in the comments section, and the most defended counter becomes the next video.
Subscribe if this channel's willingness to read the lore this close to the bone is what brought you here.